The rise and rise of Vladimir Putin. We're going to take a look at the history of USSR becoming Russia and the reign of Mikhail Gorbachev, then Boris Yeltsin, and then Vladimir Putin. Then he becomes prime minister for a small time, and again he's back as president. How did Putin manage to keep everybody in control in Russia? That's what we are going to look at in this monologue, and a small request to all of you to please like this video, and if you have not already subscribed to our channel, do subscribe to our channel. Who was Parashurama, who led a life of devotion, dedication and daring? Why did he take birth on the earth? Was it to eradicate corrupt Kshatriya rulers who had become tyrannical and oppressive, or was it to bestow daya for the needy? So where did it start? Well, during the tumultuous time when USSR got dissolved and then the beginnings of a Russian federation started under Boris Yeltsin, and then there was a whole bunch of violent switch towards capitalism. How did that happen, and how did it give rise to a lot of oligarchs, and how Putin has managed to control them, and how the West has inadvertently helped Putin in his cause in controlling the oligarchs who are all billionaires themselves. Very interesting story. Watch it till the end, and if you like it, please do share it among your friends and relatives. So the title is Billion Dollar Grab: How Russian Oligarchs Rose from the USSR's Ashes. So we have to take a step back and look at what happened to USSR. I think I've told you the reason why USSR got bankrupted. It's because the OPEC started dropping prices of crude, and the energy trade formed the basis of all of the economy of USSR. And when that dropped to below $10 for a small period, per barrel cost was below $10, that's when USSR saw the writing on the wall. Then they slowly withdrew from Afghanistan, and then the breakup started. So all this happened during Gorbachev's time. In fact, Gorbachev could be said as the last general secretary of the United Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, I think it was December 1991 when that happened, but Gorbachev was fooled by the West, particularly the United States. At that time, if I remember correctly, it was James Baker who was the Secretary of State, and he swore to Mikhail Gorbachev, he said, just allow reunification of Germany, and then the Federal Republic of Germany, or the West Germany and the East Germany, shall be combined to become one Germany, and that will become a NATO member. We will not proceed 1 inch east from there. NATO will be stopped at this point. Well, that did not happen. Under Clinton, who followed George Bush Sr., a lot more countries started accumulating into the NATO, and even now more and more countries are joining. So there is a huge problem there. They broke their word to Mikhail Gorbachev, and Gorbachev, poor guy, he didn't last very long after the breakup of Soviet Union. So in steps in Boris Yeltsin. He was the mayor of Russia. He was also a party official. He was one of the first people to basically renege against the communist system. And as this thing became worse and worse, his popularity rose, and that's how he succeeded Gorbachev. But the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ushered in a chaotic yet fertile ground for the birth of unprecedented private wealth. Why? Well, what happened was everything was state-owned, but the entity that was Russia didn't have money. They had to raise money. So people who were coming in were telling Boris Yeltsin, look, you need to switch to capitalism. You need to be able to monetize some of these things. You need to be able to liberalize the system, and so on and so forth. They had huge assets, oil refineries, oil producing places, then they had banks, they had armament factories. In between all these things, they also did a deal with the West to allow Ukraine to give away all their nuclear devices to Russia in exchange for Russia not attacking Ukraine ever. Well, that was broken in 2022. Be that as it may. So you see how at that point of time, Russia had just decided to pivot from communism to capitalism, and there were so many different things, but the market economy was just not there. So the small, shrewd, and often ruthless group of individuals leveraging connections and exploiting systemic vulnerabilities rapidly amassed vast fortunes, transforming into the powerful Russian oligarchs as we know of them now. And they have been able to shape the nation's destiny and challenge global power structures. That's what they thought. Well, the ending has a very interesting twist. So, from 87 to 91, this was Gorbachev's perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms allowed for creation of private cooperatives and relaxed state control over some economic activities. When you're talking about public cooperatives and private cooperatives is the same thing like what we have, like for example, the milk society, cooperative society of Anand, which is the brand is Amul, which is an extremely successful cooperative working system in India. It's completely privately owned, and it's been able to chart some new territories, and it is just doing boldly where nobody had gone before at the time it was formed, because it was formed before independence. Any rate, so the perestroika gave a lot of opportunities for people who had foresight, who had political connections, and also they were also borderline on the criminal side with ties to the black market. Now, when shortages happened and the state started running out of money, they would convince these state units to be sold at very, very low prices, throwaway prices even, and then resell them at massive markups. Remember 2G scam, right? Many of you may have forgotten about it. 2G scam was exactly that. Anyway, let's move on. This initial capital accumulation, often through semi-legal and or outright illegal means, laid the groundwork for future empires of these oligarchs. Then what happened? 1992 to 1994. I think December 1991 is when Gorbachev stepped down and Boris Yeltsin stepped in. They came up with a voucher revolution, a nation's assets for pennies. By the way, this period in 1993, they issued new currency, new rubles, 1993. They repeated that in 1995 also. We'll come to first the 1993, new rubles were placed, but Boris Yeltsin wanted to really privatize, and he was very sincere about it. Okay, there were some things that went wrong here and there, and he also indulged in some corruption, which was used by the West, it is believed, to blackmail him. All these things happen anyway. So, to transition state-owned enterprises into private hands, Russia introduced privatization vouchers to every citizen. Think of what happened during the land reforms implementation by P.V. Narasimha Rao in the unified state of Andhra Pradesh. What he did was he brought in Land Ceiling Act. He picked a number. He said that nobody could own land more than that, and if somebody owned land more than that, they had to return it to the government, and the government in turn would take that thing and piecemeal it and give a small piece of land to every farmer who used to farm at the bigger zamindar owned lot. Well, what happened was everybody got a piece of land, but they did not have the wherewithal to run it. They didn't have money to buy seeds. They didn't have money to buy fertilizers. And worse, they needed tractors sometimes to till the land. They didn't have money. So what ended up happening? They went back and gave their land for a pittance to the very zamindar who had been forced to cough up the land. Anyway, so this is where good intentions lead to disasters. This was Sri Narasimha Rao's effort in Andhra Pradesh. He also lost his job, but Indira Gandhi saw the goodness in him, so she pulled him into the center, and he was her confidant till her very end. Anyway, that's one story. The same thing happened in Russia also. So what happened was private citizens got vouchers for whatever things it is that they were involved in. For example, if you're working in a state-owned factory, you got a certain amount of vouchers. Now, what happened was these vouchers theoretically represented a small share of the national wealth because they were part of one state-owned enterprise and they got that. So, unfortunately for them, these were not very literate people. They didn't, literate meaning like they knew how to read and write, financially literate people, and the lack of information, we are talking about the 90s, led millions of Russians to sell their vouchers for meager sums of money. Astute individuals and nascent financial groups quickly bought up millions of these vouchers, consolidating massive stakes in former state giants from factories to mines at vastly undervalued prices. So suddenly you got these people who bought these vouchers for a pittance and made money. Then what happened was, between the periods 1995 to 1996, there was one more revision of the ruble currency under Yeltsin, and they came up with a new plan called loans for shares, the ultimate power grab. Why was that an ultimate power grab? Well, there was a budget crisis. The Russian government under Boris Yeltsin initiated a controversial loans for shares program. Private banks, often owned by the people who got rich in the previous period, loaned money to the state, that is the government of Russia, in exchange for collateral in the form of shares in some of the Russia's most lucrative state-owned companies, such as in oil, gas, metals, and mining. When the government inevitably defaulted, the banks acquired these assets in opaque auctions, often buying them from themselves at rock bottom prices, effectively privatizing the nation's crown jewels to a select few. See, some of these things have been done in India also. The IBC, bankruptcy court, has been alleged to have been misused by some industrialists to sell back the distressed asset that they used to own to themselves at very low prices, and then they would have a new entity in which they would declare these prices at market, on par with market prices, and declare a huge windfall. Now, in the late 1990s, what happened? 1993, the ruble was issued. In 1995, the ruble was again issued, but both these times it led to disaster. So Russia was on the brink of completely collapsing. Yeltsin was running out of ideas. What he did then was he wanted to try and stabilize. So one thing he did was, around mid 1997, he said that we are going to issue a new ruble, and that one new ruble will be the equivalent of 1,000 old rubles, that is the 93 issued and then 95 issued currencies. And once that happened, some things started becoming better. Also, whatever coins were issued up until 1997, those things were not recognized. Basically, people got stuck with the coins and they couldn't do anything with them. Anyway, so by 1st January 1998, the new ruble took effect, and actually that helped stabilize the market in Russia. Their currency became a little bit more stable. The post-loans for sharks era was marked by intense competition, economic instability, and often violent, tough battles, as these newly minted millionaires and billionaires were trying to corner territory for themselves and control it. And they were leveraging their vast wealth. They had media empires and political connections, and with all that stuff, they consolidated their holdings, becoming undeniable power brokers in Russia's chaotic new capitalistic dispensation. This period cemented their status as a formidable force, dictating economic and often political agendas. So you had this small set of people that had become very, very powerful. Now what happens was, I told you, right, Yeltsin was getting sick, and he was also being blackmailed by the West. There was one oligarch, I think Boris Beznetsev or something like that, and this guy was being propped up by the West as the candidate to succeed Boris Yeltsin. But Boris Yeltsin chose one of his junior vice presidents to succeed him, because he felt that Vladimir Putin, that was the name of the person, he had the best of Russia's interest at heart. Putin was neither a communist nor an oligarch. He had worked his way up through the intelligence structure. In fact, he was in, I think, Berlin, if I remember correctly, for the longest amount of time. And then he became the president of Russia. And from there on, Putin era began. What did Putin do? Well, Putin had a very good idea of how things went wrong, because he was vice president for, I think, a few years. He systematically reasserted state control over strategic sectors and curbed the independent political power of the oligarchs. Those who challenged the Kremlin, like for example Mikhail Khodorkovsky, faced imprisonment or exile, with their assets often nationalized or transferred to loyalists. A new generation of state oligarchs emerged, individuals who amassed wealth through state contract or by acquiring assets from exiled rivals, remaining fiercely loyal to Putin. And this is the most important thing. those who were loyal to Putin, they got to still have some of the powers that they had before. But then what happened? In 2014, Russia invaded and occupied Crimea. There was an election, and they said that Crimea's majority of Crimeans, I think they said the vote was 97 or something like that. Unbelievable number wanted to merge with Russia, and that was that. So, following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the annexation of Crimea happened under who? Under Obama's watch. And this was after the Maidan revolution. This was basically Putin's way of showing Ukraine who the boss is. He went and annexed Crimea, but there were still the other two, Donetsk and Luhansk. Those were still part of Ukraine, and that's where the battle for that started in 2022. Looks like now he's going to not only get that, maybe he may push all the way and join up with Transnistria, which is a small strip of land which is disconnected from the rest of Russian Empire. But if he needs to do that, he needs to go through Odessa. Who knows where he's going to stop? So that seems to be the approach for the Russian president. But anyway, while this was all happening, what did the West do when Putin annexed Crimea? They imposed sanctions. And there were more sanctions imposed when he invaded Ukraine. So in doing all these things, what happened was all these so-called oligarchs, they were having a lot of their wealth spread all over the world. Now, with the sanctions, they could not touch any of that stuff. Assets like yachts, luxury properties, bank accounts abroad have been frozen or seized, limiting their global reach and financial freedom. This has further deepened their reliance on the Russian state for protection and opportunities, cementing their role as instruments of state policy rather than independent economic actors. So, by doing all these sanctions, the West has actually strengthened Putin's hand and weakened the oligarchs' hand. So, what is today's reality? Well, today the Russian oligarchs operate in a significantly altered landscape. While still immensely wealthy, their independence and international freedom have been severely curtailed by Western sanctions. They largely function as an extension of the state, with their fortunes and influence inextricably linked to those of Putin. Their ability to act as independent political forces or to move their vast wealth globally has been diminished, forcing a consolidation of assets and allegiances within Russia itself. Their power is no longer solely economic, but deeply intertwined with and dependent on the political will of the Russian state. So, with all this happening, what the West has actually ended up doing was they have strengthened Putin's hand. Because who is going to replace Putin and keep Russia stable? That must be in the back of the minds of all the Western powers. Well, turns out that it could have been one of the oligarchs. Now they're all completely under his control. So Putin has absolute control. I don't think anyone can dislodge him from within unless he, of course, decides to step down in favor of somebody else. That's a possibility, but it gives you an idea how Putin has completely managed to take full control of the entire Russian Federation. And I have a couple of other stories also where I tell you about one of his early victories, how Putin, you needed to assert yourself boldly. That's when the oligarchs were really, really powerful and Putin was still just beginning to get started as the president. How he did that, I'll do it as a separate monologue because that is going to take me about 10 minutes to do, and I don't want to add that with this. But you get the idea. Russia has actually prospered under Putin before the war with Ukraine. I'm not sure how well Russia is doing as an economy now. Hopefully, it is going to be able to re-emerge from this once the war stops. And yes, I say it. It is important for Russia also to stop this war. It is bleeding significantly. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click on the bell button for notifications. Namaskar.